The rhythmic, artificial chirping of the heart monitor had become the soundtrack to Han Tae-Kyung's new life, a steady pulse that anchored him to the present. In the soft, amber glow of the VIP recovery suite, the Ice King was unrecognizable. He sat in a $12 plastic chair that groaned under his weight, his broad shoulders hunched as he focused on a single orange. His hands, which had signed off on the dismantling of empires and directed the cold violence of the Han Syndicate, were now focused on the delicate task of peeling the fruit without bruising the segments. Jade was asleep, her breathing shallow but rhythmic. The ghost of a smile touched Tae-Kyung's lips as he placed the neatly peeled slices on a porcelain plate, a small echo of the order she had once provided for him. For the first time in 11 years, the air didn't feel thin. It felt heavy with a quiet, fragile promise. He wasn't the chairman here. He was just Han, a man trying to learn the language of care. The silence was shattered not by a scream or a gunshot, but by the sharp, persistent vibration of his phone on the metal bedside table. Tae-Kyung's gaze didn't leave Jade's face as he reached for it, his thumb sliding across the glass to quiet the intrusion. It was an encrypted message from Sangwoo. He opened the attachment, and the breath he had been drawing so easily for the past 48 hours died in his throat. It was a high-resolution photograph. Lying on the cold, dark marble of his executive office in Han Tower was his father's Patek Philippe, the watch Tae-Kyung had left in his desk drawer as a relic of a life he intended to abandon. The crystal was shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. The internal gears were splayed across the floor like mechanical entrails. Beneath the image was a single line of text in a font that screamed of cold, familial ambition. The chair is no longer yours, cousin, but the blood always will be. Tae-Kyung felt the temperature in the room plummet. The Ice King didn't return all at once, but a frost began to settle behind his eyes. He looked at the shattered watch, a symbol of the lineage he had inherited and the violence he had perfected, and then at Jade's pale, translucent skin. He had thought he could simply walk away. He had thought that by collapsing in a hospital hallway, he could shed the monster he had become. But the Syndicate was a beast that didn't recognize abdication. By staying here, he wasn't just protecting Jade. He was painting a target on the only sanctuary she had left. His grip tightened on the phone until the casing groaned. The orange slices sat forgotten on the plate. He realized with a sickening clarity that Han Seojun hadn't just smashed a watch. He had declared that the war Jade had bled to end was only just beginning. Tae-Kyung looked at the door, his mind already calculating the security blind spots of the hospital wing. The piece hadn't just been shattered, it had been revealed as an illusion. To keep Jade safe, just Han wouldn't be enough. He would have to become the monster one last time, to ensure the man had a home to return to. Welcome back. Before we continue, please hit that like button, subscribe and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. The clinical sunlight of a Tuesday morning sliced through the blinds, casting a ladder of light across the linoleum floor of the recovery suite. For Jade, that floor looked like a vast, treacherous ocean she was being asked to cross without a boat. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hospital gown fluttering in the slight draft of the air conditioner. She felt fragile, a collection of glass shards held together by stubborn will and the lingering ache in her side where the harvest had taken its toll. Tae-Kyung was already there, his presence a dark, grounding force in the corner of the room. He had traded his charcoal suit for a simple black sweater, but the intensity in his gaze remained unchanged. As Jade shifted her weight, a low, vibrating growl of concern escaped him. "You aren't ready," he said, stepping forward before her feet had even touched the ground. His hands reached out, hovering inches from her elbows, trembling with a suppressed urge to simply lift her back into the safety of the pillows. "The doctor said the best way to prevent a clot is to move, Tae-Kyung," Jade replied, her voice soft but laced with the same iron that had allowed her to survive 3 years in his shadow. "I can't stay in this bed forever." 5 more minutes, he countered, his jaw tight. Your vitals were slightly elevated an hour ago. We wait for the next checkup. Jade looked up at him, seeing the Ice King struggling against a new kind of terror. In the Syndicate, he could calculate risks and neutralize threats with a single phone call. But here, in the face of her physical vulnerability, his power was useless. His fear was manifesting as a suffocating, overbearing shield. He wasn't just guarding the door, he was trying to guard her against the very gravity of the earth. "I'm standing up now," she announced quietly. Tae-Kyung moved with the speed of a predator, his large hands suddenly clamping around her upper arms. He wasn't hurting her, but his grip was a cage. He held her so tightly she could feel the frantic thrum of his pulse through his palms. He was bracing for her to shatter, his eyes darting to the monitors as if expecting them to scream. "Let go just a little," she whispered, her feet finally meeting the cold floor. The sensation was a shock, 1,000 needles pricking her soles. Her knees buckled for a fleeting second, and Tae-Kyung's breath hitched, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. He pulled her flush against his chest, his arms winding around her waist like iron bands. "That's enough," he rasped into her hair, his heart hammering against her ear. "You felt that, you almost fell, we're done." "I didn't fall because you didn't let me try," Jade said, pressing her palms against his chest to create an inch of space. She looked into his bloodshot eyes, seeing the man who had lost his watch, his empire, and his peace. "You can't be my cage, Tae-Kyung. If you want me to stay, you have to let me walk." For a long, tense moment, the room was silent save for the hum of the machines. Slowly, agonizingly, Tae-Kyung loosened his grip. He didn't move away, but he allowed her to find her own balance. He stood an inch behind her, his arms outspread like a net he hoped he wouldn't have to use, his face a mask of tortured restraint as she took her first, trembling step toward the window. The sanctuary of the hospital was an island of white linen and soft murmurs, but the tide of the city was beginning to seep through the cracks. Tae-Kyung was standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the afternoon sun, when the door to the suite pushed open. It wasn't the soft-footed nurse or a stone-faced guard. It was Naomi. She looked out of place in the clinical stillness, her leather jacket smelling of stale jazz smoke and rain. Her eyes, usually filled with a weary sort of pity, were now sharp with an urgent, jagged edge. She didn't look at the luxury of the room. She looked straight at Tae-Kyung, who had already moved to shield Jade's bed with his own shadow. "You're playing house while the house is burning, Han," Naomi said, her voice a low rasp that ignored the silent warning in his eyes. Jade stirred, propping herself up on her elbows. "Naomi, what happened?" Naomi walked to the foot of the bed, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. "It started 2 nights ago. The ledger people, the ones you looked out for, Jade. The janitor whose daughter's tuition you covered, the middle manager whose debt you erased. They're being purged." Tae-Kyung's jaw tightened, the Ice King frosting over his features. "Fired." "Worse," Naomi countered, her gaze shifting to him. "Some were fired with non-compete clauses that are basically death warrants in this industry. Others, they just didn't show up for their shifts. Seo-jun isn't just taking your chair, Han. He's cutting out every organ Jade ever touched. He's erasing the soul of the company because he knows that's where your real power lies." The air in the room grew heavy. Tae-Kyung thought of the leather-bound volume Jade had kept, the invisible glue that had held his empire together through loyalty rather than fear. Seo-jun was surgically removing every person who remembered what it was like to be treated as more than a tool. It was a systematic slaughter of the only legacy Jade had left behind. "He's looking for the digital backdoor," Naomi continued, her voice dropping an octave. "He thinks if he gets rid of the people who were loyal to Jade, he'll find the keys to the black accounts. He's hunting them down like they're traitors when they're the only ones who actually gave a damn about this syndicate." Jade's face went a ghostly shade of white, her hand trembling as it clutched the emerald scarf. "Old man Min from the loading docks. Is he?" "He's in hiding," Naomi said shortly. "But he won't be for long. Seo-jun is offering bounties now. Tae-Kyung turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him with a predatory coldness he had tried to bury. He had wanted to stay in this room until the world made sense again, but the world was currently hunting the people Jade had bled to protect. He realized then that Seo-jun wasn't just attacking his business, he was desecrating Jade's mercy. The peace of the hospital had been a beautiful lie. To protect the woman in the bed, he couldn't just be the man who peeled oranges. He had to be the man who stopped the purge. He looked at Naomi, his voice dropping into the low, lethal register of a commander. Tell Sangwoo to gather who is left. If Seo-jun wants a war of ghosts, I'll give him the original. The fragile sanctuary of the hospital was not broken by a gunshot, but by the sudden, terrifying silence of an empty infusion pump. Tae-Kyung was sitting by the window, his eyes tracing the jagged skyline of Seoul, when the head nurse entered the room with a look of profound, professional dread. She didn't check the monitors or adjust Jade's pillows. She simply stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped tightly over her clipboard. "Mr. Han," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "the shipment of cefiderocol, the specialized antibiotic for Ms. Lawson's post-surgical infection, it hasn't arrived." Tae-Kyung's world, which had recently narrowed down to the rhythmic chirping of Jade's heart rate, suddenly shifted back into the cold, calculated landscape of a battlefield. He stood up, his height casting a long, predatory shadow across the room. "The Han Group owns the pharmaceutical chain that supplies this wing," he said, his voice dropping into that low, lethal register that usually preceded a corporate execution. "There is no such thing as a missing shipment." "It's not missing, sir," the nurse replied, her eyes darting to the hallway where two of Tae-Kyung's guards stood. The order was flagged. It was redirected to the central warehouse by the new board of directors. They've placed a quality control hold on the entire batch. Until they release it, we have nothing left in the pharmacy. Jade stirred in her sleep, a soft, pained moan escaping her lips as the fever, the one the doctors had been fighting to suppress, began its slow, insidious crawl back into her system. Tae-Kyung moved to her side, his hand hovering over her forehead. She was burning. The infection, a ruthless byproduct of her weakened immune system after the harvest, was no longer being held at bay. Tae-Kyung pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over a contact he had hoped never to call again. He knew exactly what this was. Seo-jun wasn't just playing for the chair anymore. He was using Jade's life as a bargaining chip, turning a life-saving medication into a political leash. "How long?" Tae-Kyung asked, his gaze fixed on the perspiration beading on Jade's brow. "Without the next dose, her vitals will begin to crash within 6 hours, the nurse said. "The infection is aggressive, Mr. Han. It won't wait for a board meeting." Tae-Kyung's grip tightened on the phone until the casing groaned. The Ice King didn't just return, he solidified. He looked at Jade, who had bled out to save his sister, and realized that his attempt to be just Han had made her a target. He had tried to give her peace, but his mercy had been interpreted as weakness. He leaned down, pressing a lingering, desperate kiss to her heated temple. "I'll be back," he whispered, the promise sounding more like a threat to the world outside. He turned to Sangwoo, who was already standing in the doorway, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The time for peeling oranges was over. If Seo-jun wanted to use Jade's life as a blockade, Tae-Kyung would burn down the warehouse to get the cure. He walked out of the suite, the soft hum of the hospital replaced by the cold, metallic click of his guard's heels, ready to reclaim the monster he had tried to bury. The hospital room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the low, persistent hum of a life that was currently being held together by threads. Tae-Kyung had fallen into a shallow, restless sleep in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted back against the wall. His black overcoat was draped over the foot of the bed, a heavy, dark shadow in the sterile room. Jade shifted, her movements slow and deliberate as she fought the lethargy of the fever. Her hand brushed against the wool of his coat, and as she reached out to steady herself, her fingers slipped into the deep interior pocket. Instead of the cold steel of a weapon or the smooth glass of a phone, her skin met something impossibly soft. She pulled it out slowly. It was the emerald silk scarf, the golden chain pattern catching the dim light. It was wrinkled, smelling faintly of his expensive cologne and the sharp, metallic tang of the city. Jade stared at it, her heart stuttering. This was the piece of herself she thought she had lost in the frantic transition of her resignation, the one thing she hadn't wiped from his life. Tae-Kyung's eyes snapped open. He didn't startle, he simply transitioned from stillness to total, predatory alertness. His gaze fell on the silk in her hands, and for a moment the Ice King looked utterly exposed. "You kept it," Jade whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. Tae-Kyung leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't reach for the scarf. "I found it in the car, the night you left." Jade smoothed the silk over her lap, her thumb tracing one of the golden links. "Naomi told me you spent 3 days hunting me down. She said you told everyone I was a thief, that I stole merger specs and wiped the servers." She looked up, her eyes bright with a mix of hurt and clarity. "Is that why you kept it? Evidence for the trial you were planning?" Tae-Kyung's jaw tightened so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He looked at the scarf, the green fabric that had been the only thing keeping him from drowning in the silence of his office. "I needed a reason," he admitted, his voice dropping to a raw, jagged vibrato. "If you were a traitor, I could hate you. If you were a thief, I could understand why the air felt thin. I called you a monster because I couldn't admit that I was the one who had turned my life into a graveyard." He reached out then, his fingers grazing the edge of the silk. "I didn't keep it because you were a thief, Jade. I kept it because it was the only thing in that entire tower that still had a soul." Jade let out a shaky breath, the weight of the thief accusation finally dissolving between them. She realized then that his anger hadn't been a weapon. It had been a shield against the realization that he was nothing without the woman who knew how he liked his coffee and how to save his sister. "I didn't take anything that didn't belong to me, Tae-Kyung," she said softly. "I know," he replied, finally meeting her eyes with a terrifying honesty. "You didn't take anything. You just took the light with you when you walked out." He took the scarf from her lap and folded it with a reverence he usually reserved for syndicate ledgers, tucking it back into his pocket, not as evidence, but as a promise that the darkness wouldn't win again. The rhythmic chirp of the heart monitor, once a comforting metronome of survival, had accelerated into a frantic, jagged staccato. Han Tae-Kyung stood over the bed, his shadow stretching long and dark across the clinical white sheets. Jade's skin, usually the color of fine porcelain, was now flushed with a violent, unnatural heat. A fine sheen of perspiration matted her hair to her forehead, and her breath came in short, labored hitches that tore at the silence of the room. He reached out, his large hand trembling as he pressed the back of his knuckles to her cheek. The heat radiating from her was a physical blow. The medical blockade had done its work. The infection was no longer a lurking threat but a raging fire, and they were out of water. "Jade," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken rasp. "Stay with me just a little longer." Her eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy, unfocused, and swimming with the haze of delirium. She didn't see the man who had abandoned his empire to sit by her side. She saw the shadows of the world she had tried to save him from. "The loading docks," she murmured, her voice barely a thread of sound. "Minna, did they take her?" "No one is taking anyone," Tae-Kyung growled, but the conviction in his voice was hollow. A nurse hurried into the room, her face tight with professional anxiety as she checked the IV line that was now delivering nothing but saline and hope. She shook her head subtly at Tae-Kyung, a gesture that felt like a death sentence. The board of directors had held firm. The antibiotics remained locked behind a wall of red tape and corporate spite. Tae-Kyung turned away from the bed, his gaze fixing on the city skyline visible through the window. The lights of Seoul twinkled like cold, distant diamonds, beautiful and utterly heartless. He realized then the gravity of his mistake. He had tried to be just Han, a man who peeled oranges and whispered promises in the dark. He had tried to hide in this room, believing that if he ignored the monster he had built, it would eventually go away. But the monster was at the door, and it was feeding on Jade's life. He looked back at her fragile form, eclipsed by the tubes and wires of a system that was currently failing her. If he stayed here, he would be the first witness to her end. The sanctuary of the hospital was no longer a refuge. It was a cage. To save the woman who had given her blood for his family, he could no longer afford the luxury of peace. The Ice King didn't just return, he crystallized with a lethal, terrifying clarity. He reached into the pocket of his overcoat, his fingers brushing the emerald silk scarf one last time for strength. He wouldn't wait for a delivery. He wouldn't wait for a vote. He would go to the source and take what was hers. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in the heat of her struggle. "I'm leaving for a while," he whispered into the fevered air, "but I'm bringing the light back with me." As he walked out, the soft soles of his shoes hitting the linoleum with the weight of an approaching storm, he didn't look back. He had a kingdom to reclaim, not for the sake of the throne, but for the life of the only person who had ever made it worth sitting on. The glass doors of Han Tower didn't slide open. They seemed to part in a silent, terrified recognition of the man who had built them. When Han Tae-Kyung stepped into the lobby, the air didn't just grow cold, it stilled. The frantic morning pace of the lobby's thousands of employees ground to a halt. Security guards, men who had been taking orders from the new regime for weeks, instinctively straightened their backs, their hands falling to their sides in a reflexive posture of submission. Tae-Kyung didn't look like a man who had spent days in a hospital chair. He wore a black double-breasted suit that fit like armor, his hair swept back with surgical precision. But it was his eyes that stopped the room's heartbeat. They were devoid of the Ice King's usual detached frost. In their place was something far more dangerous, a quiet, burning lucidity. He didn't take the executive elevator. He walked through the center of the lobby, every footfall echoing like a hammer against a coffin lid. As he reached the security turnstiles, a junior officer, trembling, reached out to ask for an ID. Sangwoo, walking half a step behind his master, didn't even have to speak. He simply looked at the boy, and the hand retracted as if burned. The elevator ride to the top floor was a vacuum of silence. When the doors opened onto the executive level, the scene was one of chaotic ambition. Han Seo-jun stood in the center of the hallway, surrounded by sycophants and lawyers, gesturing toward the office that had once been Tae-Kyung's sanctuary. "The board hasn't authorized your entry, Tae-Kyung," Seo-jun called out, his voice pitched with a bravado that didn't quite mask the tremor in his hands. "You're a civilian now, a ghost." Tae-Kyung didn't stop walking. He didn't slow down. He moved toward his cousin with the inevitability of a tidal wave. The lawyer scattered like dry leaves. "I am not here for a meeting, Seo-jun," Tae-Kyung said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very floorboards. "And I am not here for the chair." He stopped inches from Seo-jun's face. The younger man flinched, the smell of his own fear thick in the air. Tae-Kyung reached out, his hand moving with agonizing slowness to straighten Seo-jun's tie. It was a gesture of absolute dominance, a predator grooming its prey. "You blocked the medication," Tae-Kyung whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a death warrant. "You turned a hospital into a battlefield because you thought I was too tired to fight." He turned his head slightly, looking at the board members peering out from the conference room. "Listen closely. The Han Syndicate isn't a company anymore. As of this moment, it is a crime scene. Every one of you who signed that blockade is an accomplice." He turned back to Seo-jun, his grip on the tie tightening just enough to restrict the other man's breath. "I'm not reclaiming my position. I'm burning the throne so no one like you can ever sit on it again. Consider this the only mercy you'll receive today. Run while the elevators are still working." Tae-Kyung let go, the silk of the tie slipping through his fingers like water. He walked past the stunned crowd and into his barren office, slamming the mahogany door behind him. The war hadn't just begun. The king had arrived to finish it. The mahogany door of the executive office swung shut, but it couldn't drown out the sharp, mocking laughter that echoed from the hallway. Han Syndicate didn't flee as he had been told. Instead, he lingered like a scavenger waiting for the lion to tire. He pushed the door open just enough to lean against the frame, his expensive silk suit shimmering under the recessed lighting of the office that was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. "You really have melted, haven't you, Tae-Kyung?" Seo-jun sneered, his voice dripping with a casual, oily malice. He paced the length of the barren room, his eyes scanning the empty desk where the peppermint dish once sat. "I spent my life watching you build this tower out of ice. I watched you bleed people dry without blinking. And now, the great Han Tae-Kyung is playing the hero for a woman who was hired to manage his calendar and fetch his laundry." Tae-Kyung stood behind the desk, his back to his cousin. He was staring at the cityscape, his reflection in the glass looking like a specter of the man he used to be. He didn't turn around, but the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a low, dangerous frequency. "It's almost poetic," Seo-jun continued, gaining confidence from Tae-Kyung's silence. "You're mirroring Chairman Park now. Remember what he said at the club? He called her your shield. He saw through you before you even saw through yourself. He knew you were weak enough to fall for the help." He spat the word help as if it were a contagion. "All that power, all that lineage, and you've gambled it on an assistant who wouldn't even be alive if it weren't for your family's charity. Tell me, does she taste like the cocoa butter she uses to hide the smell of the docks?" The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Slowly, Tae-Kyung turned. He didn't look angry, he looked profoundly, terrifyingly calm. He crossed the room with a gait so steady it felt like the approach of an executioner. He stopped when he was inches from Seo-jun, his shadow eclipsing the younger man entirely. "You think she's the help because you only understand people by what they can do for you," Tae-Kyung whispered, his voice a cold blade against Seo-jun's throat. "Park called her a shield because he was a coward who feared anything he couldn't buy. You call her the help because you're too small to see that she was the only thing in this building that was actually real." He reached out, grabbing Seo-jun by the lapels of his suit and jerking him forward until their foreheads nearly touched. "Jade Lawson didn't just manage my life. She saved my sister. She held this syndicate together while I was busy being a monster. And if you ever speak her name with that tongue again, I won't just take your chair. I will make sure you don't have a tongue left to beg for mercy." Tae-Kyung shoved him back toward the door, the force sending Seo-jun stumbling into the hallway. "Get out," he commanded, the words echoing like a final judgment. "The next time I see you, I won't be talking. I'll be finishing what you started." He slammed the door, the sound ringing through the tower like a gunshot, leaving him alone in the darkness of his own making. The fluorescent lights of the hospital recovery room flickered as the storm outside Seoul finally broke, but the atmosphere inside room 702 was charged with a different kind of electricity. Tae-Kyung had returned from the tower, his knuckles grazed and his breathing heavy, looking less like a king, and more like a man who had fought his way through a ghost story. He slumped into the chair by Jade's bed, the weight of his earlier declaration of war still hanging in the air. Jade was awake, her fever having broken just enough to leave her with a crystalline, albeit exhausted, lucidity. She had seen the news on the small bedside television, the stock prices of the Han Group fluctuating wildly as rumors of a leadership crisis began to leak. "You went back," she whispered, her eyes searching his face. "You went back for the medication." "I went back for our future," Tae-Kyung corrected, his voice a gravelly rumble. He reached out to take her hand, but he stopped, hesitant to touch her with the hands that had just threatened his own blood. "Seo-jun has the board. He has the accounts. He thinks he can starve us out by controlling the pharmacy." Jade leaned back against the pillows, a faint, knowing glint appearing in her eyes. It was the look of the woman who had managed the chaos of the Han Syndicate for 3 years without ever breaking a sweat. "Tae-Kyung, Do you remember why you never could quite figure out how I kept the international shipping audits so clean, even when the IRS was breathing down our necks? Tae-Kyung frowned. You said it was meticulous filing. It was a backdoor, Jade said, her voice gaining a strength that hadn't been there for days. When I realized your father's old guard was embezzling to fund their own side projects, I didn't just fire them. I built a digital fail-safe into the core financial server. I called it the Peppermint Protocol. Tae-Kyung's brow furrowed. The candies. They were the only things you never bothered to audit, she said with a small, fragile smile. If you enter the daily price of the organic peppermints as a hexadecimal string into the payroll encryption, it bypasses the board's authorization. It doesn't just unlock the accounts, Tae-Kyung. It redirects the syndicate's liquid assets to a blind trust in the British Virgin Islands, one I opened in Minna's name 3 months before I resigned. Tae-Kyung stared at her, stunned. He had spent years thinking he was the predator, the one who saw every move on the board, but his assistant had been the one holding the kill switch. She hadn't just been his shield, she had been his insurance policy. Seo-jun can sit in your chair, Jade continued, her fingers reaching out to finally lace through his. He can hold the tower, but he's currently ruling an empire with an empty vault. The money for the medication, for the staff loyal to us, for everything. It's already gone. He just hasn't realized he's a king of nothing yet. Tae-Kyung felt a surge of something that wasn't power but a profound, humbling respect. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. You really are the most dangerous person I've ever met, Jade Lawson. I learned from the best, she whispered. Now give me your phone, we have a pharmacy to buy. The sterile white walls of the hospital had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a brightly lit trap. With the digital peppermint protocol, now siphoning the syndicate's lifeblood into a ghost account, Tae-Kyung knew the clinical silence would soon be shattered by the sound of Seo-jun's desperation. They couldn't stay. To the world, Han Tower was a fortress, but to a man with nothing left to lose, a hospital room was a cage made of glass. Under the cover of a moonless Seoul midnight, the extraction began. Sang-woo moved through the corridors like a shadow given substance, his silent communication with the skeletal remains of the loyalist security team ensuring that every security camera on the 7th floor looped a meaningless feed of empty hallways. The transport is in the basement, boss, Sang-woo whispered, his voice a low vibration. Armor-plated, nondescript. We have a 3-minute window before the shift change at the main gate. Tae-Kyung didn't nod. He was too focused on Jade. He didn't let the orderlies touch her. With a tenderness that defied his predatory frame, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her from the bed. She was dangerously light, her head lolling against his shoulder as the fever continued to spark behind her closed eyelids. In the room next door, Minna was already being settled into a mobile reclining chair by a trusted private nurse, her recovery from the transplant still fragile, her eyes wide with a quiet, observant fear. The descent into the bowels of the hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clicking of wheels on linoleum. They bypassed the main lobby, slipping through a service exit that led directly into the subterranean garage. A black, reinforced SUV sat idling in the shadows, its engine a low, predatory hum. Sang-woo held the door open as Tae-Kyung settled Jade into the modified rear seat, his large hand lingering on her forehead for a second too long, checking for the heat that refused to die down. As the vehicle cleared the hospital perimeter and merged into the sparse midnight traffic, Tae-Kyung watched the glowing neon of the city retreat in the rearview mirror. They weren't heading for the penthouse or the fortified villas of the Han estate. They were driving north, toward the jagged, pine-covered silhouettes of the Gangwon Mountains. The destination was a house that didn't exist on any syndicate map, a modest, traditional hanok tucked into a valley where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and cedar. It was a place Tae-Kyung had purchased years ago under a dead man's name, a secret he had kept even from his father. As the car climbed the winding mountain passes, the city's glare faded into a deep, obsidian dark. Tae-Kyung looked down at Jade, whose hand was still instinctively clutching the edge of his sleeve even in her restless sleep. He realized then that for the first time in his life, he wasn't running toward a throne or away from a ghost. He was simply moving toward a place where the air was clean enough for the people he loved to finally breathe. The Ice King was leaving his kingdom behind, and in the silence of the mountain road, he found he didn't miss the crown at all. The mountain air was a living thing, thick with the scent of pine needles and the cold, clean promise of a world without glass towers. In the secluded hammock, the days didn't move to the frantic beat of a ticker tape. They drifted like the wood smoke curling from the stone chimney. For Han Tae-Kyung, the transition was a slow, agonizingly beautiful lesson in the mundane. He stood in the small, rustic kitchen, his large frame making the space feel even more intimate, his hands buried in the simple task of kneading dough for a traditional dumpling soup. Jade watched him from the low wooden table, a thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The fever had finally retreated, leaving her pale but present. She watched the way his muscles rippled under a simple linen shirt, no cufflinks, no silk ties, just the raw strength of a man who was no longer bracing for a strike. "You're over-kneading it," she said, her voice carrying a playful warmth that used to be reserved for the moments after the office went dark. Tae-Kyung stopped, his hands coated in white flour. He looked at her, and the predatory sharpness that had defined him for 11 years softened into something vulnerable. "The ledger said you liked the texture firm," he replied, a faint, boyish smirk touching his lips. "The ledger was for the syndicate, Han. This is just lunch." He walked over to her, ignoring the flour on his hands, and pressed his forehead against hers. It was their new ritual, a silent check of her temperature, a grounding of their shared reality. There was no desk between them, no assistant or chairman titles to navigate. They were learning the cadence of a quiet life, where the biggest crisis was a burnt pot or a sudden mountain rainstorm. They talked for hours about things that had nothing to do with power. They spoke of the books Jade wanted to read, the garden Minna wanted to plant in the spring, and the strange, echoing silence of a phone that no longer rang with threats. Tae-Kyung listened with a hunger he hadn't known he possessed, realizing that for years he had been starving for the sound of her voice when she wasn't relaying a schedule. "Do you miss it?" Jade asked softly, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "The tower, the feeling of the world moving because you told it to." Tae-Kyung looked out the window at the valley below, where the mist was settling into the trees. He thought of the crushed watch and the cold mahogany, and then he looked back at the woman who had given her blood to save his family. "I miss the person I thought I had to be," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "But I prefer the person you see. I was a king of nothing, Jade, here. I'm just a man who knows exactly where he belongs." As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, violet shadows across the courtyard, they sat in a silence that wasn't the empty void of the penthouse. It was a full, resonant quiet, a new normal built on the ruins of an empire. He wasn't guarding a throne anymore. He was guarding a home. And as Jade leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing steady and deep, Tae-Kyung realized that the greatest power he had ever held was the simple, quiet permission to finally be still. The stillness of the mountain night was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, eerie extinction of the cricket's song. Inside the hammock, the warm glow of the floor lamps seemed to dim as the atmosphere curdled. Tae-Kyung, who had been resting his head near Jade's hand at the low table, was on his feet before the first shadow crossed the courtyard. The domestic man was gone. In his place stood a predator who had spent a decade anticipating the kill. Sangwoo. Tae-Kyung breathed into a small radio, his voice a lethal hum. "I see them, boss. 3 vehicles, blackout lights. They bypassed the lower sensors," Sangwoo's voice crackled back, steady but strained. Tae-Kyung turned to Jade. Her face was pale, the remnants of the fever making her eyes appear unnaturally bright, but she wasn't trembling. She reached for a tablet hidden beneath the floor cushions, the same device that had initiated the peppermint protocol. "They aren't here for a conversation, Tae-Kyung," she whispered. "Seo-jun is desperate. If he can't have the money, he'll take the hostages." "He'll take nothing but a shallow grave," Tae-Kyung replied. He checked the slide of his weapon, the metallic click sounding like a final judgment in the quiet room. He stepped out onto the wooden veranda, the mountain air biting and cold. In the darkness of the pine trees, he could see the tactical infrared beams dancing across the paper walls of the house like red spiders. The first wave came with the muffled thud of flashbangs. Tae-Kyung moved with a terrifying liquid grace, a ghost in the shadows of his own home. He was the Ice King reclaiming his winter. He neutralized the first two intruders at the perimeter gate, his movements silent and final. But as he dropped a third man near the well, he realized the scale of the desperation. Seo-jun hadn't sent a squad, he had sent an army of mercenaries. "Tae-Kyung, get back inside," Jade's voice rang out sharp and commanding. He retreated just as a hail of gunfire shredded the ancient cedar pillars. Inside, Jade was huddled over the tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "I'm not just managing the money anymore," she said, her teeth gritted against the pain in her side. "This house, you bought it from a former intelligence officer, remember? He didn't just install floor heating." As the mercenaries breached the inner courtyard, Jade swiped a final command. Suddenly, the fog lights around the perimeter didn't just illuminate the space. They pulsed with a high-frequency strobe designed to induce immediate disorientation. Simultaneously, the sprinkler system, fed by the icy mountain spring, erupted, not with water, but with a fire-suppressant foam that turned the stone tiles into a frictionless trap. The elite killers slipped and spiraled, blinded by the strobes. From the shadows of the veranda, Tae-Kyung and Sang-woo picked them off with clinical precision. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. Jade had turned the sanctuary into a weaponized labyrinth. When the last of the intruders lay neutralized in the white foam, the silence returned, heavier than before. Tae-Kyung stepped back into the room, his black shirt stained with rain and grime. He looked at Jade, who was slumped against the wall, the tablet glowing faintly in her lap. She had saved them not with a gun, but with the same quiet brilliance that had once organized his life. He knelt beside her, his bloody hand hovering before he tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I told you," she whispered, her voice failing. "You don't need to be a monster, Tae-Kyung. You just need to listen to your assistant." The aftermath of the siege left the Hanok smelling of ozone and pine, but for Han Tae-Kyung, the air was finally beginning to clear. He didn't spend the morning cleaning the foam from the courtyard or counting the shell casings. Instead, he sat at the low wooden table in the main hall, the glow of Jade's tablet illuminating a face that had aged years in a single night. Beside him, Jade sat wrapped in a heavy quilt, her color returning as the stolen antibiotics finally did their work. "It's ready," she whispered, her finger hovering over a command that would do more damage than any tactical squad. Tae-Kyung looked at the screen. For over a decade, the Han Syndicate had been his skin, a cold, armored layer he thought he needed to survive. To most, the files Jade had decrypted looked like standard corporate tax returns, but to the trained eye, they were a roadmap of every shadowport, every shell company, and every laundered one that flowed through Seo-jun's fingers. "If we do this," Tae-Kyung said, his voice a low rumble, "there is no going back. The Han Group survives as a legitimate logistics firm, but the Syndicate, the thing my father built, it dies today." "It's not a death," Jade replied, looking him in the eye. "It's a divorce. You're finally leaving the monster behind." Tae-Kyung didn't hesitate. He didn't reach for his gun or call Sang-woo to arrange a hit on his cousin. Instead, he applied a final digital signature to a comprehensive whistleblower packet addressed to the Financial Supervisory Service and the International Maritime Organization. With a single tap, he leaked the encrypted logs of the syndicate's illegal shipping, wings directly to the authorities. He wasn't just bankrupting Seo-jun. He was making the syndicate's black market assets impossible to own. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the bank account Seo-jun had fought so hard to seize would be frozen by global regulators. The Ice King had just signed the death warrant of his own throne, and for the first time his chest didn't feel tight with the weight of it. In Seoul, the sirens began to wail around Han Tower, but in the mountains, there was only the sound of the wind through the pines. Tae-Kyung closed the tablet and turned to Jade. He took her hand, not with the grip of a boss, but with the steady warmth of a partner. "The board will be in handcuffs by evening," he said quietly. "Seo-jun will have plenty of time to reflect on the help while he sits in a cell." "And us?" Jade asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Tae-Kyung looked out at the valley, where the mist was finally lifting to reveal a brilliant, untainted blue sky. "We have no more files to wipe, Jade, no more schedules to keep, just a life." He realized then that the final signature hadn't been an act of destruction, but the ultimate liberation. He had traded an empire for a kitchen table, and as he watched Jade's steady breathing, he knew he had won the only war that actually mattered. The afternoon sun filtered through the paper screens of the hanok, casting long, warm rectangles of light across the floor where Minna sat. She looked smaller in the oversized knitted cardigan she wore, but the gaunt, sickly shadows that had haunted her face for years were finally receding. For the first time since the surgery, the girl who had been the silent catalyst for every war Tae-Kyung had ever fought looked like she was truly alive. Tae-Kyung stood in the doorway, watching her with a familiar, heavy intensity. To him, Minna was a living ledger of his failures, a constant reminder of the physical cost of his life. He approached her with the cautious reverence he might show a glass sculpture, placing a tray of tea on the low table with practiced, silent care. "You should be resting, Minna," he said, his voice dropping into that protective, gravelly register. "The mountain air is getting cold. I'll bring you another blanket." Minna reached out, her small, pale hand catching his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Oppa," she said softly, using the term of endearment that always seemed to pierce through his armor. "Sit down, please." Tae-Kyung obeyed, sinking onto the floor cushions, but his posture remained rigid, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of pain or fatigue. "I talked to the specialist this morning. Once the syndicate's legal dissolution is finalized, I'm moving the foundation's funds to a clinic in Switzerland. You'll have the best care in the world. I'll make sure you never want for anything again. I owe you that much." Minna looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of her long illness. "That's just it, isn't it? You think you're paying a bill." Tae-Kyung frowned. "I'm taking care of my family." "No," Minna countered gently. "You're guarding a debt. You look at me and you see a sacrifice that Jade made, and a burden that you have to carry to make up for it. You think my health is a trophy you have to protect to prove you aren't a monster anymore." She leaned forward, her voice becoming a soft but unwavering command. "Tae-Kyung, my life isn't a debt to be paid back. It isn't a penance for what you did in that tower. It's a gift. Jade didn't give me her kidney so you could spend the rest of your life as my bodyguard. She gave it to me so we could finally be a brother and sister, not a king and his ward." Tae-Kyung looked away, his jaw tightening as he struggled with the raw honesty of her words. He had spent so long defining himself by what he provided and what he protected that he didn't know how to simply be. "I want to see you happy, not just vigilant," Minna whispered, squeezing his hand. "Stop trying to earn my life. Just enjoy it with me. Let Jade see that the girl she saved is living in a home, not a fortress." The Ice King didn't shatter this time, he simply let go. Tae-Kyung took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, looking at his sister not as a responsibility but as a person. For the first time, the weight of the crown felt lighter, replaced by the simple, terrifying, and beautiful reality of being a brother. He squeezed her hand back, a small, genuine smile finally breaking the stoicism of his face. Okay, he rasped. No more fortresses. The roaring engine of the Syndicate had finally stalled, replaced by the rhythmic, eternal sigh of the East Sea. The beach was exactly as it had been on the night Tae-Kyung first tracked Jade down, the sand a cool, silvery white under the descending sun, the air sharp with salt and the scent of wild grass. But the man standing on the shore was different. The charcoal suits had been traded for a soft linen shirt, and the predatory stillness in his frame had transitioned into a hard-won peace. Jade walked beside him, her step steady now, the phantom pain in her side nothing more than a quiet reminder of a life she had survived. She wasn't carrying a tablet or a schedule. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of a light cardigan, her hair catching the sea breeze. Behind them, two sets of footprints stretched back toward a modest house on the cliffside, a home where Minna was currently laughing at a clumsy joke Sangwoo had made while preparing dinner. "It's too quiet," Jade said, though her voice was bright with a teasing warmth. "No sirens, no billion-dollar crises, no organic peppermints." Tae-Kyung stopped, turning to look at her. The Ice King was a ghost now, a story people told in the boardrooms of Seoul to frighten the ambitious. In the golden hour of the beach, he was simply a man. He reached out, his fingers finding hers and lacing them together. His grip was firm, but the tension that had once defined his every touch had evaporated. "The silence is the best part," he replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "It means there's nothing left to hide from." He looked out at the horizon, where the sky was bruising into shades of deep violet and bruised orange. The Han Syndicate was being dismantled piece by the authorities, its illegal roots withered by the sun he had let in. He had lost his tower, his fleet, and the fear of 10,000 men. And yet, as he looked at the woman beside him, he felt a wealth that the Han group could never have calculated. "You know," Jade whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder, "I used to think I was just your shield, that my job was to make sure nothing ever touched you. And now I think I was just waiting for you to realize you didn't need one." Tae-Kyung turned her toward him, his hands cupping her face with a reverence that felt like a prayer. He didn't see an assistant, and he didn't see a debt. He saw his partner, the person who had stood in the line of fire until he was brave enough to step out of it. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers, breathing in the scent of the sea and the simple reality of her presence. "No titles," he murmured against her skin. "No monsters." "Just Han," she agreed. The sun finally dipped below the water's edge, leaving the world in a soft, hopeful twilight. They turned away from the ocean, walking back toward the lights of the house where a family was waiting. There was no empire left to rule, but as they walked hand in hand up the dunes, they knew they were finally heading toward a future that belonged entirely to them. I hope you enjoyed this story of Han Tae-Kyung and Jade Lawson. Please like and subscribe to see more stories like this. See you in my next video.